Thank you for coming. Special thanks to Mr. Olters for finding time to come and speak to us. I'm Girta Avdio, I'm from the Economics Club, and today's event is organized in cooperation with Professor Haydar Kurbe and our club. Before giving the floor to Mr. Olters, I would like to give a short biography of our guest speaker. Mr. Olters joined the World Bank since 2007, and prior to that was engaged with the International Monetary Fund for 9 years. He has been country manager in Kosovo since 2011, and he manages overall program delivery. In addition, Mr. Olters held teaching positions at McGill University and also the Community College of Vermont, and was included in media as a co-editor at the World Economic Affairs. Mr. Olters holds a doctorate degree in economics and also has many published articles that are related to political economy, macroeconomics, and natural resource economics. Apart from German, which is his primary language, he also speaks English, French, and Albanian too. Now I would like to invite Mr. Olters for his lecture on World Bank and its support to Kosovo. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the very kind words of introduction. Thanks to Professor Corby, to the faculty of the American University, and particularly this very impressive crowd of students, and I understand it's not only this room, so my regards also to the students in the overflow room. I think it's always a great pleasure to talk about challenges of development. I think you might have heard me say it before, I think we talk too much about political challenges and not enough about challenges of development. Okay, this is the one. All right, I will see whether that works. Yeah, okay. I do not require any technical assistance on that anymore, I think. I mean, when we look at where Kosovo is, actually, and you probably will have noticed that as well as an economist, it is quite interesting because it is not really an issue of various degrees of gray. There's a lot of black and white, and then there's more black and white than I've seen in many other countries that I've worked in and on. I think starting from where Kosovo is and within the global context, what you see here is the growth performance between 2008 and 2013 of all the countries that are member of the IMF and the World Bank. And you will see that Kosovo is doing all right. It is growing at average rate, so close to the growth rates for the global economy, considerably faster than the EU average, faster than the other countries in the Western Balkans, but not as fast as quite a few others. And that is, to some extent, I think, the core of what I try to be talking about in this lecture, and I will certainly leave room for question and answers following this short presentation. Not least to understand, get your feedback and then see where you see the most important challenges. The core challenge, I think, in devising economic policies, not only in Kosovo, but certainly in Kosovo as well, is to see to which extent it would be possible to increase at a sustainable level the growth potential. And even if one could only increase potential growth by a little bit, as long as that can be maintained over a long period of time, the cumulative effects will have a relatively important impact on the overall outcome. At present, even though Kosovo has grown faster than the EU, which we would expect and require, still Kosovo is relatively poor with about 11% of per capita income compared to the EU average. So if you look at it, there's a clear, you can either look at it mathematically or you can look at it more visually. These are essentially the same two graphs. There is a clear relationship between the average growth differential between Kosovo and the European Union and the time that it takes to reach the average per capita income prevailing in the European Union. If you look at the growth experience 2011-15, where the EU has grown at around 1% on average, Kosovo has grown at around 3.3%, you will see that it takes too long to reach the EU level. At more than 90 years, that's several generations. I think having followed the domestic debate, it is clear that there is not enough patience to wait until then. If one wants to accelerate the reaching of EU living standards, it is essential to increase growth rates beyond the current growth potential of 3–3.5% that we have, and find ways to see what are really the root causes that block the development of Kosovo to reach growth rates of 5, 6, 7% on a prolonged period of time. And you will see, or you see here, if you just compare growth rates between 3.5 and 7%, the dynamics of this are entirely different. If there is a way to get anywhere close to 7% for a prolonged period of time, you will see that at some point there are very dynamic developments that would be very tangible, including on the labor market. It is a very difficult challenge, but not one that is impossible. And there has been, unfortunately, published in the worst possible year, 2008, when we all talk about crisis economics rather than growth and development, a very important panel of economists, several Nobel Prize-winning economists, plus policymakers, both in business, were assembled in the so-called Growth Commission. And then they published, you will find it, if you just Google Growth Commissions, you will get the growth report and can download it. It's a really nice read. I can highly recommend it to everyone. This report looked at those 13 countries that have had a history of growth higher than 7% for more than 25 years. There are only 13, but very different countries. There are small ones like Malta and big ones like China. There are those with natural resources and those with all the landlocked countries in between. There's even an African country in between. So it's a very heterogeneous group of countries. And what this report did, by involving lots of consultations around the globe, with about 200 or more papers that sort of fed into this report, they were trying to distill those features of resemblance that all of these countries had in common. It still does not make for a growth strategy or an economic model, but I think it is a really important input. What are elements that should probably be inside such a growth model to be able to unleash the potential that any country has in accelerating its growth potential. Against this backdrop, let's go back to Kosovo. And when I said it's a little bit of a black and white, it's also a little bit of difference between where we are in terms of micro and macro. The overall macro numbers actually don't look that bad. Not only did we have, as I talked about, a relatively solid growth track record, with Kosovo having been one of only 3 countries in Europe that has not gone through any recession during any of the major crises after 2008, whether that's the global financial crisis or the Eurozone crisis. It has grown steadily throughout and has proven quite resilient, much more so than any of the neighboring countries, with Albania and Poland being the other 2 countries. Every other country went through a severe recession, some of them double-dip recessions. You just look at the neighbor to the north and you see or you look at Montenegro, you see the very different experience in a very challenging environment. Similarly, you have done that while not accumulating any legacy issues that would prevent you from setting off a much faster growth period. The fiscal is generally under control. You've had relatively controlled fiscal deficits of around 2%, plus minus a little bit over the years. A stock of debt, public debt, that is below 13% of GDP, much, much lower than any of the neighboring countries, even though that excludes the Paris and London Club debt. For political reasons, it is serviced by Serbia for as long as it does not recognize Kosovo, otherwise it will automatically be added. But that's about 10%, and even then Kosovo compares quite favorably to many of its neighbors. And maybe most importantly, if you look at some of the crisis episodes with the resultant social impact, I mean, look at Greece, look at Spain and a few other countries. Look at Montenegro, a little bit closer by. The banking sector has proven healthy, sound, and profitable. To the extent that it has developed a basis and an understanding of the local context that there has been in the last few years actually quite an encouraging development in terms of interest rates. They have come down quite a bit. In parallel, non-performing loans have come down quite a bit. So the risk premium, the implicit risk premium that banks have had in lending to the private sector, in lending for development, has gone down as well. So on that side, there are a lot of features that need to be maintained, protected, and built on in developing a development strategy, an economic model that places Kosovo in a position to accelerate its growth rate. I think where the real challenges lie is this slightly trickier part, I think, that is generally described as business climate. Business climate comprises lots of different elements. There's not this one key that opens all of it. And it includes a number of areas that are particularly binding. I think those of you that have read the progress report from the European Union yesterday have gotten a feeling of what remains in terms of building and strengthening public administration, making it more effective, and ensuring that the value for every euro spent from the budget is increased. It includes, I think, very dramatically the energy sector as one of the key elements of any business that wants to have large-scale economic activities in Kosovo. And of course, education remains a challenge to bring it up to standards where the exchange of students from here with abroad is done on the same level. A lot is happening. I think it is encouraging that Kosovo for the first time will participate in PISA this year as sort of an indication of not only where Kosovo stands, but also where would be the priorities in addressing particular weaknesses as they exist. To back up, I mean, this is when we talked about the strong macro, this is just sort of the development of budget deficits and public debt, all in the green zone. This is, I think, in a summary graph of the development in the banking sector that in many ways I think is equally encouraging. You see that there is a general trend towards increased financial intermediation without there being any dramatic changes. You see that the banking sector continues to have excess liquidities as the loan-to-deposit ratio remains at around, at this point, slightly below 80%. But no large fluctuations, no dramatic adjustments. It is a sector that is clearly developing and increasingly, I think, a very helpful partner for the private sector in developing, building or developing its business. Now to the challenges. The macro story, as encouraging as it generally is, and as resilient as the economy of Kosovo has been, what it has not yet achieved, however, is to really have a tangible impact on the labor market. And the labor market remains, in many ways, the Achilles heel of Kosovo's economy. It is, I think, the most frequently quoted figure, of course, is the unemployment rate that currently stands at 35% on average. As you can see, significantly, that is on the y-axis, it is significantly higher for women and even more so for youth. In many ways, the even more worrisome figure is the employment rate that stands at 27% overall. Similarly, with much more pronounced challenges for women and even more pronounced challenges for youth. We have seen in the last year the unemployment going up from 30 to 35%. For, as far as I can see, for two reasons, one good and one bad. The good reason was that quite a number of discouraged workers that had left the labor market altogether re-entered. Felt sufficiently confident that they were starting to look for employment again. And that has increased the labor market as reflected in the increase in unemployment. The more worrisome part was that 2014 has proven to be a very difficult year economically, largely for two reasons. One was the energy crisis that followed the explosion at Kosovo mid-year, and second was the political crisis that followed the elections also mid-year. And there we see a number of impacts that started with growth rates, that's the blue line, having decreased from our potential growth rate from around 3–3.5%, to which we expect to return this year to 1% last year. That was a pretty dramatic decrease, reflecting the hesitation by the private sector to invest, the hesitation by households to consume. Uncertainty is one thing that the private sector does not like at all. Similarly worrisome, and I think one area where these episodes of political uncertainty impact the state and the state administration with it, the ability to realize investment is reflected in its ability to collect tax revenues, and particularly indirect taxes like VAT. Direct taxes like the income tax are more backward-looking. The VAT is much more, the payment of the VAT is much closer to the actual economic activities. And this yellow line you see in 2014 particularly, tax collection relative to GDP as a relative term is decreasing as well. So there is a double impact that contributes to the challenges faced by the finance minister in years of political turmoil. Not only does growth decline, but also payment discipline and the ability to collect taxes is decreasing as well, particularly for indirect taxes. Secondly, financing is becoming much more difficult and more expensive. These are, okay, it's starting to get slightly, I don't know what's the right term. It's almost a slight artistic feel to it. These are it's the development of the T-bill market. which has started to be an immense success, where you've seen, I mean, starting from the 3-month T-bills, the white ones, and the 6-month, where the interest rates have come down quite dramatically in the first few years, up to the beginning of the political crisis. And you see the increase of interest rates, and ultimately the fact that interest rates have not fully returned to the pre-crisis level has added elements of a risk premium also to the government's or the state's ability to borrow from the private sector. Just as of an indication that these episodes characterized by political uncertainty do have a direct economic consequence, making it a whole lot more difficult not only to focus politically on the development of such a longer-term development strategy, but also make its implementation a whole lot more difficult. Taking all of these factors together, let me walk you through a little bit through where, from our and from the World Bank's angle, we see the key challenges that Kosovo is facing. Again, you start on the bottom with a generally strong macro foundation, including the financial sector, clearly areas where Kosovo, relative to its neighbors and to many countries in the EU, is having a comparative advantage. It should, by all means, try to defend that, and I think the entire setup that Kosovo has, by having agreed to adopt the euro as a sole legal tender, by a very tight fiscal framework within which the Ministry of Finance has to operate, I think there's a good basis to see that continuing. Also, I think the Central Bank of the Republic of Kosovo has had a pretty good track record in monitoring the development in the banking sector to make sure that this happens. So, this brings us then to where the challenges start to materialize. As I said, the Achilles heel being the high rates of unemployment, the low rates of employment, which in turn is a reflection of the still very narrow production base that you will see reflected, I think I don't have to explain that to you, in the balance of payments under the large external deficits, which in turn reflects the low domestic productivity in many of the key sectors. And I think here we come to the point where a look at, I think you're all economists, at the basis of the endogenous growth theory becomes really, really important. Because that is, in the end, where Kosovo will have to go. Its current growth model, which is essentially resting on 3 pillars: remittances, foreign aid, large public investments. And all 3 of them are important and will remain important. Maybe it's at a slightly declining level and contribution to growth. So in many ways, Kosovo doesn't need to have a completely new growth model, but it needs to complement it. It needs to complement it through reforms that aim at achieving or facilitating, fostering and supporting catch-up growth to standards prevailing elsewhere in a given sector. There are a number of sectors where I think we are seeing encouraging signs where this is happening. One would be agriculture and food processing, where I think even in a very non-scientific survey of products that you see in the supermarket, import substitution, at least in the 4 years that I've been here, clearly has taken place. There are more and more products that are very competitive for food processing, essentially trying to go back to a situation that Kosovo had pre-war conflict, where the country has been quite self-sufficient in terms of food produce. The ICT sector is one that also has shown sectoral growth rates far above the economy's average. But these examples in certain sectors that show that there is a possibility to really generate these endogenous growth rates, those that are driven from factors from within, from increased domestic growth rates, that in our view will have to remain the focus. To do that, and then some of these elements that feed into that are linked to the experiences coming from, or arguments that have been stressed also by the growth report that I mentioned earlier. One, of course, is if you want to increase domestic productivity, and then you talk about innovation and improvements in the application of technology. Given that Kosovo is not yet at the innovative frontier, you don't have to reinvent the wheels. You essentially catch up and import the knowledge, the standards and technologies that are used elsewhere. And clearly, the further a country is away from the innovative frontiers, the longer it can use these factors to move forward at a much more dynamic rate for prolonged periods of time. I think the one example that many have analyzed in recent years to quite some extent is China, for instance. China has done exactly that. It has been trying to catch up to standards prevailing elsewhere. Turkey, during its high growth phase, has been doing exactly that. Malaysia has been doing exactly that. But to be able to do that, and then you probably would have to look at it sector by sector, because the relative importance of various aspects of this might differ. But I think they all have in common that in the end you have to remain open. You have to remain open for knowledge. For knowledge, and one way to quickly import foreign knowledge is to have the exchange of students with foreign universities, of professors, of researchers, so the cross-fertilization of what is happening here and elsewhere. The more that can be fostered, the more that happens, the better it is for the development of Kosovo. In many ways, in my view, one of the strongest arguments that Kosovo can use to push for visa liberalization with the EU, that this cross-fertilization as a contributory to its economic development potential is a key factor. Second big pathway to import foreign standards and technologies, of course, is foreign direct investment. And that it's important to attract foreign investors of the scale, scope, and quality, and that part is really important, to really have an impact on a given sector. And that includes privatizations. And there, I think, at least in the public debate, I've seen 2 out of 3 really core debates being had. The ones, clearly, what is the impact on the budget? Really important, you should not sell a public asset for too little. A lot of discussions on the process. Was it transparent? Was it fair? Could one follow on the streams of money, funds being paid? All of that critically important. But the third part that I think has to conclude this picture is, what is the role that the private sector should play? What are the expectations vis-a-vis the investor? Can the investor bring in the investments that will increase the quality of production, of the provision of service in that sector? can it help to increase domestic productivity? And I think that part in many debates has not been looked at sufficiently. The openness to trade to the outside world being one part that is critically important in the debate on and the development of such a growth and development strategy. The second big element is probably slightly trickier because it relates to the general agreement that you forego current consumption for future consumption. You forego current consumptions to save and invest into the future. To do that, and to have that willingness by a society as a whole, there has to be, I think, the conviction that this initial investment at the present will have a payoff in the future. So these, what I mentioned there, the fundamental bargain between the present and the future, has as a basis essentially two elements. A, it requires a certain core consensus across the political aisle on what are core elements of such a development policy. Because if we talk in the earlier graphs not about a few years, we are talking about decades. If you talk about decades in developing a country, then of course we would expect that any party at some point will be in government. And so if you go 2 steps forward and 3 steps back and 3 steps forward and forth, there has to be some agreement on some core elements that is being developed irrespective of who is in government. And I think there is still ample opportunity to forge such a core consensus on what are these key elements that would make for a development strategy for an economic model that works for Kosovo. And that is something that has to be done internally. That's very little where any internationals, including the World Bank, can really contribute. And ideas, input, debates, lectures, all of that can be had. But in the end, that is a discussion that needs to be had internally. And secondly, if you do that, and if you find this consensus, the second key element is, of course, that we have governments that are committed to achieving these objectives. And that at times are committed to pay a short-term political price for a long-term development objective. So the strategic approach to looking at development challenges before looking at tactical political gains is a critically important element of that. If anyone has a good idea of how to achieve that, it would be an interesting discussion. But I've been asked to talk, so this is the broader context, a short, simplified summary of how I see things fitting together. And if you take that, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about how the World Bank fits into all of that, that would be then the summary of where the World Bank, in our view, and in discussions with stakeholders in government, outside government, where we sort of currently are moving. If we agree that in the end the core challenge lies in increasing domestic productivity, in making sure that goods and services made in Kosovo become competitive in the local market, in the regional market, and ultimately in the European Union. And in that, Kosovo has a gigantic advantage compared to many other countries in the world, because you have right next door a very important market of 500 million people that have purchasing power, to which you can supply commodities and services of all sorts. And look at ways to broaden the production base and ultimately have an impact on the labor market. And in that we see 3 blocks where the World Bank could support the development of Kosovo. Maybe not surprisingly, energy is one of them. Energy, or the lack of energy security and the challenges of energy affordability is, in our view, one of, if not the single biggest obstacles to being able to attract foreign direct investment of the scale, scope and quality to really have this impact on productivity. All the advantages that you have, a generally well-educated, a committed, a young labor force, an open labor force, willing to learn, can't really use any of that. If next to your factory you have to build your own private power plant just in case. So to find a resolution of this challenge that has been, I think, with all of us for quite some time, is a critically important part. And to link that into the broader policy framework. I think one of related challenges, irrespective of what happens in the energy sector, including not doing anything, will have an impact on tariffs. And tariffs ultimately have only one objective. Tariffs are charged, the idea being on a cost recovery basis to ensure that there is energy available 24/7. It does not per se have a social component to it, even though historically and in many countries there are elements included that are trying to do exactly that. But any state has another instrument available to rectify any outcomes that are undesirable through social policies. So having 2 instruments and 2 objectives, that can be done. So linking tariff policy to social policies, making sure that the most vulnerable households can afford energy, linking all of that with sort of the broader energy policy on trying to reduce the losses, increase energy efficiency, do demand management, all of that should help to make this work. Second big element is, I think similarly, not a surprise, is education. Even more important in a young country with demographics like you have in your country, even more important in a country with the same legacy that Kosovo has had, and being in the process of rebuilding a system that is open, that is competitive, that is successful, that provides you in the end with the skills that you really need. And the graduation, the diploma is one thing, but to really be successful in the labor market after graduation, it is the skills that you take out of school that really matter long term. And I think that's the area where still quite a bit of work needs to be done to make sure that everyone gets the best possible head start into the labor market. And then the final area where the World Bank is continuing to provide support is the business climate and then all the various aspects that relate to that. Whether it is support of the financial sector, financial literacy, and all of that, whether it's the cadastre system, making sure that land administration as a key component for any particular small and medium size, but also for any investment to be successful in the marketplace. Or the proper management of the natural resources that Kosovo has. And here also areas of doing resettlement right. Mining cannot work if those areas of making sure that the environmental rehabilitation after the use of the land, the process of resettlement is done right, none of that will work and be sustainable. And then sort of allow for this longer term development strategy that spans over decades until Kosovo managed to really fully integrate, manages to integrate politically and economically into the EU. I think that in a nutshell is how we see the types of challenges we are facing. Now it's your time, I think, to protest, criticize, and say we are all wrong and should do something entirely different, or simply ask questions. Thank you very much.
We will be taking questions for Mr. Olters, so
Hi, Mila Krasnici. I'm a student here. It's my senior year. I just wanted to ask you about the third component of what the World Bank is doing in Kosovo. What are specifically the steps undertaken by World Bank in supporting the private sector? And just before that, what do you think is actually the biggest challenge that the private sector is currently facing here?
And ultimately, the challenge of the private sector is a lack of confidence. The lack of confidence that it can calculate the costs along the way. And insecurity, uncertainty is the single biggest deterrent, I think, to any private sector activity. I think no one who comes here as a potential investor and looks at Kosovo is expecting that everything works like speak. That's okay. But I think it's important that when a contract is signed, that an investor can rely on the contract being enforced. And if there are problems, that it can be resolved in the court. But there's a confidence on there being a level playing field. When you tender for or submit a tender for certain services, that you really look at price and quality, and only that to make a decision. Essentially that you know the rules of the game and the ability to be able to price it. I think there is a lot of understanding of there being infrastructure bottleneck. That is sort of the phase in which Kosovo is. Maybe with the exception of energy. Because an energy crisis will asphyxiate not only new activities, but also those that are already in place. And I mean, to some extent, it has an element of insecurity for as long as you don't know what is really happening. And then just the more certainty you have of what happens when, at what price, that creates the confidence and that helps the private sector to make rational decisions and to make that difference between yes, I do it, not yes. The more question marks you have, the more you move towards the no, not yet side of the equation. Of course, there are, and sort of in terms of how the World Bank supports the private sector. And let me give you a few examples. I think one project where we think our contribution was quite successful was in the area of land administration, where the World Bank has supported the Kosovo Cadastral Agency in developing a network with the municipal cadastral offices. It's more decentralized in Kosovo than in other countries for obvious legacy reasons. So to have offices that are sufficiently open that as a client, as a citizen, you see what is happening. That they have the hardware, the software, and the knowledge to map the various plots to provide you with land titles that in turn can be used by the private sector to access, for instance, capital. When you go to the bank and they ask for collateral, take the agriculture sector. Typically the one big asset that you have is your land. So you need to have that land title. You need to be able to prove that yes, it is my land, as one important part in the ability to actually invest, modernize your production, and then sort of move towards being more competitive. We've helped and supported the central bank in setting up a real-time growth settlement system that essentially will allow the real-time transfer of funds within the domestic banking system. A number of examples that go in that direction of where in discussions, not only with government, but with stakeholders more broadly, there are key bottlenecks identified, where the World Bank is not only providing the funds, but I think more, or equally importantly, at times more importantly, the technical expertise of someone who actually knows that. And who knows here how an RTGS system is supposed to work? Probably not many, I don't. But the bank is big enough that it has people that do. And they can be picked and sort of for this very specific issue come here and really help to make this work. I think in that the World Bank is relatively unique in that it really combines the ability to provide financing, and for Kosovo it is still on very subsidized terms, with the ability to access expertise, either in-house or if we don't have it in-house, through consultants, to make sure that any project that we support can indeed be implemented.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, Professor Waszak.
I got a question. And this is a all right. Your energy is one of the key elements to this entire strategy for fixing things. So I've got a question, because wood fuel use here in Kosovo, which is a substitute for electricity in lots of the rural areas, the energy sector, electricity in general, and economic development, they're three kind of really interrelated things. And the one key element that's going to help to address any of that is building a power plant, perhaps a power plant big enough to make Kosovo an energy exporter. How realistic is that? Do you think there's any kind of time frame where that could actually happen?
Okay, you're tapping into a debate that's been ongoing for the last 12 years or so.
Just want to ask me your opinion.
And it has changed to some extent. And in many ways, so this idea of having a coal-fired power plant big enough to be an exporter, that was a plan that was almost ready to go in 2008. And then two things happened entirely outside the control of Kosovo. One was the global financial crisis, and with that disappeared the ability to finance such investment. And secondly, the debate on the effects and mitigation of climate change started roughly at the same time. For the World Bank and all multilateral development banks, but also our own authorizing environment, that is the governments that support us, including Kosovo. There was a rethink of what an energy strategy should look like. And you will see, I mean, Paris is about to happen. There's a clear movement and desire and pressure to move out of fossil fuels as much as possible. The as much as possible then becomes the tricky part. The World Bank's energy strategy ended up, after years of discussion, about 4 years of discussion on that, that principally the World Bank is not supporting coal anymore, except in certain instances. And these exceptions are defined in the Strategic Framework for Development and Climate Change, the 6 criteria spelled out. It has to be one of the countries with most development needs, those that are supported by either countries that really do not have alternatives, that still try to exploit energy alternatives to the extent possible. So within that, there was an exception. Kosovo fit on all of that. On our side, as part of this broader energy strategy, we looked at and developed an option study to see what really would be a potential option and what would it cost. And would it be possible, and I think that was the anchor of the support provided by the World Bank, would that suffice to be able to decommission Kosovo A? Our studies, and then we're in the process of updating it, continue to show that there is no more cost-effective alternative, even if you include all of the costs for externalities, carbon costs and all of that. But not at the size that would make Kosovo an energy exporter on coal alone. It really is aimed at being able to replace Kosovo A, do it at a technical standard that is compliant with all the EU directives, particularly the Industrial Emissions Directive. That is to have a power plant being built of technical standards that could be built also inside the EU. At present, there were direct negotiations between the government and the sole investor for this project. I haven't seen where they are ending up or have ended up. I've seen as much as everyone else has that there was some movement, but I don't have any details. All of that, of course, has to be seen then in the context of, I mean, it's not, I think it's important to see that it's a multi-pronged energy strategy that is supported. One that has one element, the baseline energy generation capacities through coal, but then of course the modernization of distribution, and with that the reduction of losses, both technical and commercial. Efforts to increase the ability of proactive demand management, including energy efficiency. A look at the ability to use maybe as a decentralized way of energy, renewable energies. We still use about 45% of energy, not electricity, of energy for space heating purposes. So there's a lot of potential there. And then sort of have all of this combined in a comprehensive multi-pronged energy strategy, which is just one aspect. I think a lot has been done in terms of preparation, but we are at a very critical stage right now. And it should be very interesting to see what happens in the next few months.
Can I just relate to my question? So then, in this situation, I would like to know regarding the partial risk guarantee that the World Bank is committed to give. So, where do you stand now, given the agreement that is being made between Kosovo and the government? And I mean, are we about also to see that environmental and social impact assessment is going to be
And the process has to be that first you know the investor, the proposed technology, to actually be able for the bank to take any final decision. So the first finalization, after assuming that there was now an agreement, would be to finalize the ESA. It's in a very advanced draft stage, and then to make sure that what is being proposed is consistent with what's being analyzed. So that should be consulted publicly as a draft within the next few weeks. That should be pretty imminent. At least we try to have it done this calendar year or early next calendar year. But this is very, very close. Once the ESA is one of the key documents that will be part of the project proposal that ultimately will be sent to the World Bank's Board of Executive Directors. That then includes the broader socioeconomic analysis, the technical analysis, the financing analysis, the impacts on households, the impacts on tariffs, how we handle that. And there's a whole array of things that go within that and that are being addressed as part of our due diligence as we speak. The World Bank's decision will be a decision made by the board on the partial risk guarantee. As we have said earlier, and we continue to say, we are fully supportive to helping Kosovo to ensure energy security with the cleanest possible, most affordable energy mix that we can think of.
I think Andre has a question, then Iriona raised her hand before, so.
Andy Jr. Since 1999, 50 projects are applied or implemented from the World Bank in Kosovo, and $400 million US were spent. How efficient was the World Bank program and policy implementation in Kosovo, in the case of Kosovo?
My answer might be a little biased. More seriously, the challenges faced by Kosovo after 1999 are all those related to state building. In every sector of the government, of all of the various components that are necessary to have a private sector be able to develop. The way the World Bank works, at least we have our own internal ex-post assessment for every project relative to the various results being specified in the results agreement. With a view, and then these steps are also done within the project cycle to be able to address issues that we see them developing during implementation. I'm relatively convinced. I mean, I don't know every single project that predates my time. I have a pretty good view of also the recent projects. There was a very careful attention not only to the various parts that were agreed in terms of implementation, but also of the results that were specified ex ante. And then that is being followed and looked at a more aggregate level, even in the context of the country partnership strategy. There was a recent midterm review of the current strategy, which will end mid-next year. There will be an ex-post assessment of the overall strategy, which is sort of the aggregation of the various interventions that the World Bank has done, both in terms of projects, but also in terms of advisory services, technical assistance, additional support that the World Bank is providing outside the lending by government. I'm looking at the portfolio that we currently have and the results that we have achieved. Actually, I'm quite proud of what has been achieved. Some of them are quite transformational. And I think one impact that I think everyone can feel is the end of the open ash dumping at KEC. The ability to do this through a system where slurry is created and it's being pumped in an abandoned mine, being able to now cover every single open landfill means that when there's wind, not only the ash is not flying all over the place. So the black snow and overleach and all the effects that it has had on Pristina, that has gone. And I think we can look back on that and are quite proud of having been able to support those investments that were necessary to make that happen.
I'm Indiana, I'm a senior, and I have a question related to the energy sector. The World Bank has assisted in building the third largest power plant in South Africa, and we have seen the drawbacks that have happened there related to health and also the environment. And I just wanted to ask, won't we experience the same drawbacks as in South Africa?
No, and the only thing these two investments have in common is that they're based on coal. In the particular context here, I think the commitment and the constraints from our side, but also the changes in technology ever since, and that's also a few years back, have been quite substantial. As a signatory to the Energy Community Treaty, Kosovo has agreed to adhering to the environmental standards defined by the Industrial Emissions Directive and the best available technology reference documents by the EU. And that is a precondition for the World Bank to support this project. And the short version of that is, it is a power plant of standards that could be built inside the EU as well. The ESA that has been mentioned, but also other analyses on our side, efforts made by the government that has been committed in ensuring that this, what will end up being the biggest investment that Kosovo has had in a really, really long time, will end up being a success. It is the economic lifeline that without which development cannot happen, and for which unfortunately there are no alternatives. But it, I think, is generally understood that if you have to do it, you have to do it right. And that has a number of elements that have to be looked at jointly, which I think to some extent explain part of the long time it has taken to get to this point. One has to look extremely carefully at all the financing and affordability sides, because energy is no good if no one can afford it. You have to look at all the social sides to it and make sure that there is a structure in place that allows for resettlement to be handled the way it's supposed to be handled. And of course, there's this big environmental part to it to make sure that the externalities are minimized and are treated properly. The request for proposal for the current investment has been very explicit in these elements, and certainly our support is dependent on being able to demonstrate that all of these aspects are being carefully taken into account.
I don't know how many other questions.
I want to add to the new Kosovo power plant. So we don't know exactly what they agreed last time, but as I understand, this project is quite complex, and the process will continue to be complex in the coming months and years. What do you think will still be the biggest risk for this project? Securing financing, or will there be other things? Because, for example, the Resoluta, they had once quite a lot of things after the that financing seems to be quite an issue, potentially for other markets as well, but Kosovo particularly. So do you think securing financing for the Kosovo power plant will turn out to be the biggest challenge?
The biggest risk is always that what you don't expect. And financing you can plan, and it's in itself extremely difficult and a big challenge. But I think there are enough people involved with the expertise to make sure that in the end it works, and that the incentives are such that Kosovo is not left with an investment route. That would be clearly in no one's favor. I think many technical challenges, as difficult as they are individually, can be addressed. But I think the biggest challenge in everything is the unforeseen that happens along the way.
How many other questions we will be taking some more?
I can keep on talking until everyone's fallen asleep or run out. We can take a few more. I'm trying.
We will be answering them after we take some questions. Is that okay?
Hi, I'm Angie Bushra. I'm a senior here in the UK. I wanted to also ask regarding the energy sector. What do you think is Kosovo ready to decommission Kosovo are? And you also mentioned the energy community. Do you think that some of the criteria set on Kosovo from this community are a bit too ambitious for us to fulfill?
Okay, any other questions? Andrew, fine.
I'm the Atomic Meti and a junior here, and I'm jumping the energy bandwagon also. Has the World Bank thought of an alternative to decentralize the electricity in Kosovo and maybe subsidize private people or businesses on and have a feed-in tariff? And what would be the outcome of it?
Okay. Maybe next time I'll just have an energy lecture. On the last point, I think it's critically important to understand that both what is being tried and done here and where the World Bank supports Kosovo is a much broader energy strategy, where the power plant is one of many elements. You will have seen, or you might have seen, that relatively recently we approved a $31 million project on energy efficiency and renewable energy. And through this project, some of the issues that you have addressed are being supported. And there are feed-in tariffs for some renewable sources, not for others. For Kosovo to be able to have energy security, to be able to pay for it, it requires that all the various elements are looked at and implemented at the same time. It is generation with traditional fossil fuels, it is generation with alternatives to the extent that is possible, and I think there are developments in all sorts of directions. The Wind Atlas, supported by KfW, has just been published a few months ago. The developments in solar, the developments in biomass, and all these things have to happen as well. It's not an either or. It has to be a development towards the efficient use of an energy mix. But the energy mix, as far as we can see it, cannot be one without coal, whether we like it or not. But the situation is as it is. I think every part of this puzzle is equally important, and all of these have to happen together to allow Kosovo to finally escape from the current situation of load shedding and power cuts, and then obstacles to private sector development. In terms of being able to decommission A and having standards that are too tight, again, so this is the flip side of the coin of the earlier question. In many ways, on the standards, I'm deeply convinced that Kosovo deserves more political credit than it gets in really trying to do it right. In being serious in applying the standards as they are within the EU. And that's where Kosovo wants to go. It also doesn't make sense to build a substandard, apart from environmental reasons and everything else, but economically alone, it doesn't make sense to build a power plant with lower standards that once you join the EU, you have to decommission. It makes no sense. To do it right is clearly it's difficult, but given experiences that have been made, including in this country with externalities from coal, it is critically important, and I think in the end it will have proven beneficial to Kosovo that has taken this long to end up with an energy strategy that is as close as possible to a core consensus on where where the energy sector should be heading. No one probably is going to be entirely happy, but I think many of the arguments and concerns that have been voiced along the way have been taken into consideration. It's been a very, very challenging process for everyone concerned. But things have been moving in the right direction. I think every single concern has been looked at very, very carefully. I think it's actually been a very encouraging sign of maturity of this country, the way it has developed in recent years. Is Kosovo ready to decommission A? Is of course a very delicate question in the context where you don't have a clear timeline. What happens to the replacement investment? In the end, there will have to be a discussion, negotiation with the Energy Community Treaty and the EU on the sequencing of investment and decommissioning and how all of that happens. And it is clearly not an option to leave Kosovo in the dark for a few years and say we'll be back 4 years down the road. I think that is understood. But that part is still being discussed and not decided.
If there are no more questions, I would like to thank once more Mr. Olters for finding time to come here and give this informative lecture to us. Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here.
I thank all of you for being here, for being active, for great questions, and I think this interest in development, including the development of the energy sector, is critically important for this country. Keep on doing that. Thank you.